All right, welcome everybody to the second roundtable session. 2 weeks ago, we began this process as a bit of an experiment, but I think also very much something that is needed at this day and age in a time of severe crisis, the likes of which no human alive that I know has ever lived through. So it is extremely important that these types of discussions become something that we really get used to and expand upon and make contagious in a very serious way, since humanity is at a very serious crossroads. We've had moments where we've come close to a systemic breakdown, as well as a drive for hegemony by one or another group that believes itself to be the rightful hegemon of the planet, and other groups that don't think the same way, and rightfully so. But this clash of ideologies tends to result, if combined with military power, into a lot of death. And today, when combined with thermonuclear weaponry, something which we cannot walk back from for many generations. So it's a very important time that we have this discussion. Today, we're going to have several presentations. I'm going to do something a little historic. We have Dimitry Lascaris, a friend, somebody who is an activist, a lawyer, somebody who has established himself as a serious voice of peace across Canada, who has really brought the message of the truth of what's been going on in Ukraine to many Canadians and the population of the world more broadly. And he is going to present something on some current events very shortly. And after that, Gardner is going to go into some solutions. Ed will be here, as always, to help facilitate some dialogue. I myself have a few words to say, as I mentioned, about some historical dynamics. I ask that people forgive me. I just came back from an extended camping trip where it's been a little cold, and I'm still fighting back a flu. So if my voice fails, please bear with me. Just going to admit some people in the room right now. But I'm going to begin by just doing a brief little screen share, which should help the process a lot. Share. And Ed or Dimitry, since you guys are co-hosts, if you see people coming in the waiting room, feel free to just let them in if they arrive late. Okay. Just make a full screen here.
I'll do that.
Thanks.
No problem.
All right, let me just do a little. It should be my formal remarks shouldn't be more than 15, maybe 20 minutes. Now, what I took note of as I was planning out my component of the presentation, is that people know of the figure, the very strange, weird creature of Ryan Routh, if I'm pronouncing his name properly. Who was discovered to have been a recruiter of Afghan, Syrian Free Army soldiers that would end up fighting with the Azovs in Ukraine. Very strange character. I'm not too sure who his handlers were. But he's been in Azov recruitment videos. I actually watched one of them, and that is partially surprising, but in this day and age, probably shouldn't surprise me that much. And this is the figure, for those who don't know, who was caught with a few guns waiting outside of one of Trump's golf courses to shoot former President Trump, who just wrote an article, which was a decent article with Bobby Kennedy Jr. called "Negotiate with Moscow in the Hill," really making a very clear point that this drive for approving long-range missiles, which luckily seem to have been rejected or at least postponed by the American side momentarily, but that this could result in a nuclear holocaust. And there was some very strong remarks by both men. So the fact that this individual, Routh, who found himself in Azov recruitment videos, was tied. Yeah, there's something weird, right? Now, as a historical point of context, which is a bridge to what I'm going to say, somebody brought this to my attention that a declassified CIA document demonstrates that the Azovs were actually behind an attempted assassination attempt of President Franklin Roosevelt in the late 1930s. And this is a brief little one of the hundreds of pages that were recently declassified from 1942, featuring an Azov soldier who had killed the Polish Minister of State in Warsaw before escaping down to Argentina and then Chile in 1942, Gregory Mitseko. So there's a historical dynamic here, or a pedigree that I found interesting, or is an irony that I found interesting to just start with. But here, back to the starting point. Here, I'm just going to admit some people. Now, Franklin Roosevelt is somebody who I find very important. The current collapsing system was established in some measure in Bretton Woods in 1944 and was really brought online after World War II. I'm going to go into a little bit of the connection between that systemic banking collapse and the drive for war. But first, in a book written by Franklin Roosevelt's son and his assistant, Elliot Roosevelt, Franklin made a point in 1944 to his son saying that, any number of times the men in the State Department have tried to conceal messages to me, delay them, hold them up somehow, just because some of those career diplomats over there aren't in accord with what they think I know. They think they should be working for Winston. As a matter of fact, a lot of the time they are working for Churchill. Stop to think of them. Any number of them are convinced that the way for America to conduct its foreign policy is to find out what the British are doing and then copy that. I was told 6 years ago to clean out the State Department. It's like the British Foreign Office. In that same book, there's a little dialogue between Elliot and FDR one night after some battles with Churchill. I think this is at Yalta, where he says here that I'm talking about another war, Elliot. I'm talking about what will happen to our world if after this war, we allow millions of people to slide back into the same semi-slavery. Don't think for a moment, Elliot, that Americans would be dying in the Pacific tonight if it hadn't been for the short-sighted greed of the French and the British and the Dutch. Shall we allow them to do it all over again? Your son will be about the right age, 15 or 20 years from now. One sentence, Elliot, then I'm going to kick you right out of here. I'm tired. This is the sentence. When we've won the war, I will work with all my might and main to see that the United States is not wheedled into the position of accepting any plan that will further France's imperialistic ambitions or that will aid or abet the British Empire in its imperial ambitions. Unfortunately, FDR dies April 12th, 1945. Immediately you have Anglophile Truman taking over the position, didn't even know about the atomic bomb. All of a sudden, he's briefed that there's this doomsday weapon. 2 weeks later, FDR is not there for the first San Francisco UN conference. A lot of those same deep state creatures at the State Department that he had warned his son about are now in a very dominant position around John Foster Dulles. And you have now nuclear bombs unnecessarily dropped on a defeated Japan. Peace negotiations had already been moving across back channels through the Vatican. Books have been written about that. But that is ignored. The bombs are dropped anyway as a message to Russia. The OSS by September 20th is disbanded. A purge of the patriots within the military begin. And by March 5th, Churchill delivers his famous Iron Curtain speech. And at the same day, you have the UK-USA Signals Agreement launched, establishing the Five Eyes, what becomes the Five Eyes and grows across all of the Anglo-speaking nations of the Commonwealth, plus the USA. So that special relationship is now established. Churchill, within his Iron Curtain speech, says neither the sure prevention of war nor the continuous rise of world organization will be gained without what I have called the fraternal association of the English-speaking peoples. This means a special relationship between the British Commonwealth and the Empire of the United States. And the Empire and the United States. The U.S. hadn't fully embraced an imperial doctrine at that point. Henry Wallace, very important figure in the story of our lives, was vice president, got downgraded through some shenanigans in the Democratic Party, power brokers, was made Commerce Secretary under Truman by this time. And he made a point in an essay right before he got fired by Truman for trying to warn of an oncoming world war. He said that fascism in the post-war inevitably will push steadily for Anglo-Saxon imperialism and eventually for war with Russia. Already American fascists are talking and writing about this conflict and using it as an excuse for their internal hatreds and intolerances towards certain races, creeds, and classes. This is obviously referring to the dual function of both racist imperialism that was encouraging the growth of the KKK, Jim Crow laws at home, and how a lot of the same power structures were directly tied into the conversion of the U.S. into an Anglo-American imperial system abroad. As I mentioned, September 2046, Wallace is fired. The Truman Doctrine a little bit later is announced, whereby the U.S. gets meshed into into a subversive program on behalf of British interests in Greece. And you have all of a sudden an enmeshment in foreign conflicts, which is something George Washington and better Americans always warned against getting enmeshed in foreign intrigue. But that is now thrown out the window. The CIA is created September 18th, 47 now, completely different constitution, different management, different philosophy. Even though the OSS had massive problems, the CIA is a much more controlled beast under the helm of people like Allen Dulles and many others. Harry Dexter White dies. You know, the mentioned that the Bretton Woods institutions, World Bank, IMF, the GATT, the system that later on became the World Trade Organization. These were not allowed to live up to their intended purpose, as FDR outlined, that the idea was supposed to be an anti-colonial mechanism, that these would extend originally credit for small countries that had been abused by imperialists to access the type of long-term credit that the U.S. was able to develop under FDR through the New Deal, through the Reconstruction Finance Corporation that transformed the Tennessee Valley from a backwater hole of illiteracy into a cutting-edge engineering powerhouse, and many other types of projects all across the United States in the 30s were just one aspect of what leaders like Nkrumah, leaders from India, leaders from the Pan-African movement came to the American nation to study, to see how they could bring this lesson back to their own country. And FDR, Harry Dexter White, the first president of the IMF, were very much supportive of that, as well as the idea of a U.S., Russia, China alliance of cooperation that would build these projects together to end what FDR called the four, or what he called his four freedoms: the freedom from want, the freedom from the fear of secret police, the freedom of religion of conscience, that would be there for everybody. I'm missing one, but anyway, it's the principle. The most important thing, and I think often overlooked in this story, is NSC 75, July 1950, is a directive to essentially save the British Empire. It doesn't say it that way, but essentially the logic of this National Security Council memorandum is that if the British, now that we're at a new existential war with communism, if the British Empire releases its nations to independence, and those nations might go and ally with Russia or China, which is an existential threat to the capitalist nations. So now it becomes, more logical to do everything that's possible to defend the economic structures controlling and managing those member states of the former British Empire, which is now known as the Commonwealth. But really, honestly, in name only, in many of those countries, they were never granted economic independence. The other aspect around the same time that is important for the story is Joint Intelligence Committee, which submitted an estimate of the nature of the nuclear threat from the Soviets. It's called JIC 502, titled "The Implications of Soviet Possessions of Atomic Weapons," 1950, that assumed, utilizing Rand Corporation computer modelers who became hegemonic in decision-making, especially after JFK was murdered, in U.S. military doctrine, that it assumed that once the Soviets had 200 atomic bombs, that they could launch and would launch a surprise attack to defeat the United States. And it was a lot of Freudian projection here, but this would be the first to put forward a justification for the preventative first strike concept, supported by a massive military buildup under the pretense of a preemptive war. So again, a new type of shift of doctrine began that grew and grew into, and Zbigniew Brzezinski had his hand in amplifying this preemptive first strike doctrine. It's disgusting. But again, very much based on a rejection that human beings are human, who could actually talk through and are oriented towards problem solving and looking for peaceful win-win cooperation. It rejects that completely in favor of these very bestial, Hobbesian game theory models that presume that everybody has only the nature of might makes right? That we want to destroy the weak around us to get more for ourselves materially. And that's really all humans are. So it's sick, but that's the animating principle of this beast. I found this interesting. UK Prime Minister Clement Attlee made the point over and over again. We have seen that there is another power than that which has its seat at Westminster. The City of London, a convenient term for a collection of financial interests, is able to assert itself against the government of the country. Those who control money can pursue a policy at home and abroad contrary to that which is being decided by the people. That's a decent UK Prime Minister who wasn't in there very long after World War II. Few characters also to keep in mind is that there was a certain Rhodes Scholar named Yandell Elliott who trained a variety of people, Kissinger being another one, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, Huntington, Zbigniew being others, who played a very devious role in overseeing a new system, especially that emerged over the dead bodies of many nationalist leaders who, when you look at their policies, were all looking for points of win-win cooperation, ending the death, cutting through the Gordian knots of the Cold War of mutually assured destruction. There's just some of many leaders assassinated during the 1960s, one of whom wasn't assassinated, de Gaulle, but who survived 30 assassination attempts, so power to him, but didn't succeed at all in achieving what he had set out to do as far as establishing a cooperative policy based on industrial cooperation with nations that were supposed to be our enemies. Rounding it out here, and then I'll end in the next 4 minutes. 1971 is an important year, I find. You have not only the Inter-Alpha Group created under Lord Jacob Rothschild as a blueprint, that's major banks set up private institutions in each of the dominant European nations that grew in scope and scale. That was set up in January of 1971. You've got a student of Henry Kissinger named Klaus Schwab setting up the World Economic Forum. Also, he is the same man who described Maurice Strong as his mentor. When Maurice Strong died, he was a co-founder of the World Economic Forum, same month. U.S. dollar floated by what becomes the Trilateral Commission leadership. George Shultz, Kissinger, David Rockefeller, who end up dominating soon in the administrations of Ford and especially Carter, float the dollar. Now you have an age of deregulation is unleashed. You know, a new ideology is that we're not going to be a producer society anymore. We're going to outsource our manufacturing in the so-called developed world, and we're going to become addicted to cheap labor as we become a new identity of consumers and speculators who make money with nothing, except maybe unpayable rates of debt that become securitized, gambled upon, or treated as somehow an asset, even if we're not producing anything physical in the real world. That creates necessarily a time bomb. Any bubbles pop, all bubbles pop, whether it's the tulip bubble or anything. And those who I believe orchestrated this little sleight of hand, taking a viable industrial base economy and turning it into an unproductive speculative basket case of bubbles based on casino logic, knew exactly the consequences that this would become a time bomb at some point to be triggered. The Trilateral Commission, as I mentioned, is founded in 1973. Kissinger, I thought this was a very useful speech he gave at Chatham House in 1981. May 10th, gave a very useful speech. I cited most of it in one of my books, where he describes the clash between FDR and Churchill leading up to the end of World War II. And he makes a point that he prefers the Churchill philosophy much more than the naive nationalist worldview of FDR. And people can read that whole speech. It's available online or in my books. Where he says the British, describing his time as Secretary of State, the British were so matter-of-factly helpful that they became a participant in internal American deliberations to a degree probably never practiced between sovereign nations. In my White House incarnation then, I kept the British Foreign Office better informed and more closely engaged than I did the American State Department. It was symptomatic. And I make the point that he's also a knight. He was knighted for services to the Order of St. Michael and St. George in, I believe it was 1995. 1983, 1995. 1983, Lord Rothschild gives a blood-curdling speech describing two broad types of giant institutions, the Worldwide Financial Services Company and the International Commercial Bank, with global trading competence may converge to form the ultimate all-powerful, many-headed financial conglomerate. He's describing the need, which is done in the Big Bang in Great Britain in 86, Thatcheromics, Reaganomics, the deregulation of the system and creation of universal banking, the breaking up of what becomes later on under Clinton, Glass-Steagall's destruction, the separation of commercial and investment banking. That separation, he's saying, must disappear so that we can create universal one-stop banks, too big to fail, as they came to be known in later years. And things accelerate. We got the Big Bang, as I mentioned, the total collapse of the system, derivatives are normalized, the Maastricht Treaty. So instead of dealing with the economic collapse of 87, Greenspan comes out normalizing creative financial instruments. The Maastricht Treaty undermines any residual sovereign nation and nationalism within European nations. goes a long way towards the Lisbon Treaty later on. Soviet Union, shock therapy begins. You got NAFTA signed as well, something Kissinger said is the greatest step towards the New World Order, the undermining of any types of ability of economic interference by sovereign nation states of the North American continent into the free markets, basically. So corporations could start suing nations for doing things like protectionism, something that came undone under President Trump, but obviously that's short-lived. The World Trade Organization is founded where there once was the GATT, and Glass-Steagall, as I mentioned, is destroyed. President George Bush also made a knighted into the Order of St. Michael and St. George. This is more relevant than I think people realize in 1993, after being president. He says that we have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order where, when we are successful, and we will be, we have a real chance at this new world order. Former CIA and guy whose father was a patron of the Nazis who got, Prescott Bush, people know that story. Strobe Talbot, another Oxford Rhodes Scholar, one of about 30 that came in with Bill. Bill Clinton made the point in 1992 in a Time magazine op-ed that all countries are basically social arrangements, no matter how permanent or even sacred they seem at any one time. In fact, they are all artificial and temporary. Perhaps national sovereignty wasn't such a good idea after all, but it has taken the events in our wondrous and terrible century to clinch the case for world government. So again, this theme, it just always comes back. Somehow we won't have wars anymore if we just have world government run somehow by an enlightened elite that just knows better than the unwashed, dirty plebes and masses who shouldn't be tolerated to govern themselves anymore, or else we just keep getting wars, completely ignoring the role of actual City of London financiers, intelligence agencies, and Wall Street sociopaths who have actually found their hand behind most of the wars I've looked at of the 20th century and even before that. So that's my little component of the presentation. It's been a little more than 20 minutes. I do apologize. My voice is shot. We'll open up for Q&A and some dialogue after this, but I'll leave it to Dimitry to take the next leg of the journey.
Thank you very much, Matt. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
I must say I always am immensely enlightened by Matt's presentations, and this was certainly no exception. I learned a great deal. Thank you, Matt. As Matt mentioned, I am based in Canada, but nowadays I spend more and more time in Greece, where I am today. And part of the reason for that is that I'm finding the opportunities for public discourse in Canada, honest, intelligent public discourse, are evaporating, and that the environment is becoming, for honest and open discourse, considerably more repressive than at any point in my lifetime. Ever since the special military operation began in February 2022, Western governments have sought systematically to destroy all opportunities for dialogue with the Russian Federation. The consequences of this approach could be, of course, catastrophic for all of humanity. And in Canada and the United States on September 13th, a few days ago, we saw a dramatic demonstration of the Western government tendency to choke off all possibilities for dialogue with the Russian Federation and the Russian people. And on that day, the US State Department issued a statement leveling new accusations against Russia's state-controlled broadcaster, RT. The essence of the State Department's allegation is that RT is simply an arm of the Russian intelligence services. And according to the State Department, and I'm quoting, according to new information, much of which originates from employees of Russian state-funded RT, we now know that RT moved beyond being simply a media outlet and has been an entity with cyber capabilities. It is also engaged in information operations, covert influence, and military procurement. These operations are targeting countries around the world, including in Europe, Africa, and North and South America. Close quote. The State Department did not provide a scintilla of evidence to support any of these claims. It did say, it alleged, that much of the evidence, quote, originates from employees, close quote, of RT, but it did not identify any of those employees, nor did it repeat exactly what they allegedly told US authorities. Also, we simply have no way of assessing their credibility, nor the context in which their statements were made, whether, for example, they were induced to make statements that incriminated RT, whether they were threatened, cajoled into doing so, whether their statements make any sense, they're coherent and internally consistent. We just simply do not know because none of their testimony has been proffered. Now, despite the complete absence of any supporting objective evidence behind the State Department's September 13th allegations, Canada's government almost immediately issued on that day a highly similar statement from the Foreign Minister of Canada, Mélanie Joly. And her statement read in part, quote, "Canada, alongside key partners, strongly condemns activities carried out by Russian state-owned media entity RT, formerly known as Russia Today, to attempt to diminish Western public support for Ukraine, influence electoral outcomes in Western and non-Western states, and undermine support for and commitment to the rules-based international order and its associated institutions." And she continued, "Canadian intelligence," she said, "has shown that since Russia's full-scale illegal invasion of Ukraine, RT has become actively engaged in Russia's global disinformation and influence efforts by acting as an extension of Russian intelligence services, relying on state-backed hacking, psychological information operations, covert influence, and military procurement." So I hope you will see just to what degree this statement of the vassal Canadian government mimicked the statement of the US State Department. One difference was, of course, is that Mélanie Joly purported to be relying on Canadian intelligence rather than US intelligence for these allegations. But again, she didn't provide a scintilla of evidence to back them up. And I can assure you that the Canadian Securities Intelligence Agency, which is the Canadian edition of the CIA, or MI6, has a pathetic reputation for dishonesty. It has repeatedly been chastised by Canadian courts for making misrepresentations to courts of law, not simply to the public in the public arena, but actually to sitting judges. And in one of the more recent criticisms leveled by a Canadian judge against CSIS, the Security Agency of Canada, that judge identified its propensity to, shall we say, play fast and loose with the truth as systemic. That's the word that the judge used, systemic. So why anybody would take the word of CSIS for any allegation against an official adversary of NATO is a mystery. And particularly when the allegations were not accompanied by any granularity whatsoever. Mélanie Joly didn't even purport to have evidence of RT employees to back up the allegations. Now, to me, two aspects of Mélanie Joly's statement were particularly striking. First, she stated the following: RT's efforts include engaging and recruiting Western political commentators and influencers, including Canadians, with the primary goal of leveraging them to produce and disseminate content that would call into question and reduce Western public and political support for Ukraine. And what makes this statement particularly troubling for people like me, and I'll come back to why I say that, is that it happened in the context of a recent warning issued by Canada's Minister of Public Safety, Dominic LeBlanc. And what LeBlanc stated was, any Canadians who illegally assist in Russia's persistent attempts to use disinformation, criminal and covert activities, and corruption to undermine our sovereignty and democratic processes will face the full force of Canadian law. Now, as I indicated, I take all of this quite personally. The reason for that is because I happen to be one of the very few Canadians who continues to appear on RT, notwithstanding its vilification by the Canadian political establishment and intelligence agencies. And I do so with some regularity, probably on average a couple of times a month. And suffice it to say that I have been very critical in numerous of my appearances on RT of NATO's escalation and provocation of the war in Ukraine. And these criticisms are precisely what Canada's government is so irritated about. And is threatening Canadians to deal with by means of criminal prosecution. Now, as an aside, and I always make a point of clarifying this, I've never been paid a single dime for my appearances on RT. I've never sought compensation in any form. I've never been offered or promised compensation in any form by RT. And as I explained recently in a video statement about these recent threats from the Canadian government, I would be happy to accept invitations onto the Canadian corporate media to express my views about the Ukraine war or any other matter that is of interest to me. But ever since about 2016, when I emerged as a very vigorous critic of Canadian and American foreign policy, I've effectively been blackballed by the Canadian media. Prior to that time, I was regularly consulted by the Canadian media and quoted by the Canadian media. And so RT remains one of the few major media organizations that regularly invites me onto its platform. And as long as the organization is giving me access to its audience, as long as it imposes no restriction on what I can say, and it never has, and as long as it's inviting me to talk about subjects that are of interest to me, I see absolutely no reason why I should refrain from appearing on RT and gaining access to its audience. I personally am not aware of any credible objective evidence that RT works with Russian intelligence. But what I find particularly striking about Madame Jolie's comment is that she went on to say this in her statement of September 13th. These hostile activities, and she's referring here, of course, to RT's alleged cooperation or work with Russian intelligence, go far beyond those of a legitimate media organization, and they go against any generally accepted code of journalistic standards, practice, and ethics. RT's reprehensible activities are done covertly, which clearly demonstrates their lack of transparency to the public and to the stage in which RT operates. I found this to be an amazing statement, and the reason is this. About 3 weeks prior to the September 13th statement of Antony Blinken and Melanie Joly, a character by the name of Adam Zivo confessed that he had been working since late 2022 with the security services, the intelligence services of Ukraine and Canada. Who is Adam Zivo, you may ask? Adam Zivo is a columnist for a newspaper called the National Post, which is headquartered in Toronto and is the flagship newspaper of Canada's largest newspaper publisher. It's a very important newspaper. And during the course of the time that he was working with Ukrainian and Canadian intelligence, and he himself, on his own initiative, admitted this, he outed himself in August of this year for reasons that are mysterious to me, but nonetheless, he made this admission repeatedly. And at the time that he was working with these agencies, he was writing numerous pro-NATO and Russophobic articles in his capacity as a columnist for the National Post. And not one of those articles was accompanied by a disclosure that he was working with the Canadian Security Intelligence Service or Ukrainian intelligence. Again, this is something that is quite personal to me because in May of 2023, last year, I went to Russia on my own initiative. I spent a month there. I'd never been to the country before, and the whole purpose of my going there was first to report on what was happening in the country in my capacity as a journalist, but also I wanted to try in my own way, however limited my ability to affect the course of events may be, to generate a dialogue or foster a dialogue between Canadians and Russians. And no one invited me to the country. No one paid for my trip. I paid all of the expenses of my travel alone, and they were considerable. No one restricted what I could say or do in any way, shape, or form. I spent the first 2 weeks of that month-long trip in Moscow, and then I went to Crimea. I took a train all the way down to Crimea. And I spent 10 days in Crimea. I hired my own fixer and my own translator to accompany me and my own driver, all at my own expense. No one reimbursed me a dime. And while I was traveling in Crimea, I got a call from Adam Zivo. And Adam Zivo introduced himself to me. I didn't know him at the time as a columnist for the National Post. He did not disclose to me, of course, that he was working with Canadian or Ukrainian intelligence. And he asked me if I would submit to an interview. He wanted to talk to me about why I had gone to Russia and why in particular I was in Crimea, which he insisted was illegally occupied by the Russian Federation. So I've been attacked repeatedly by the National Post over the past 10 years, so I had some suspicions about all of this, although I never imagined that this man was working with Canadian and Ukrainian intelligence. And so I told him that I would do the interview on two conditions. One, I had to record the entire interview because I didn't want anybody to misrepresent anything that I said. And secondly, I had to be at liberty, if I so chose, to publish the recording in full. And he agreed to those two conditions. He then interviewed me for 2 hours when I was in Sebastopol. And then on the following Monday, his newspaper published a front page article, the National Post, the flagship newspaper of Canada's largest newspaper publisher, in which it accused me of having gone to Russia to whitewash Vladimir Putin's alleged crimes, and that I was effectively a Kremlin shill. That article was, of course, not accompanied by any disclosure that Adam Zivo was working with Canadian or Ukrainian intelligence. I have since sent a letter to the National Post threatening to sue them, and it is my intention to proceed with this threat for a claim of fraudulent misrepresentation, because I was not told that he was working for the security services. And I offered them the opportunity to avoid litigation if they either retracted this hit piece that they published about me, or they inserted into it a disclaimer and disclosed to the public that at the time that Adam Zivo wrote the article, he was working with Canadian Ukrainian intelligence. The National Post has done neither of those things. And at the same time, it has not denied the truth of what Adam Zivo says. In fact, Zivo said that he told his employer, his editors at the National Post, that he was working with Ukrainian and Canadian intelligence services throughout this period. And there's been no denial about this from the National Post, nor, importantly, has there been a denial from the Canadian government that its security services were working with Adam Zivo during this period. And yet, Melanie Joly has the audacity, the temerity to lecture the state-owned broadcaster of the Russian Federation for working with Russian intelligence, only 3 weeks after Adam Zivo's revelations came to light. We are operating here in a level of repression and hypocrisy which is without precedent in my lifetime. And I worry very much that this escalation is happening because it is the intention of Western powers to escalate the war in Ukraine beyond any level we've seen thus far. And Matt made reference to the fact that we came very close to direct confrontation between NATO and the Russian Federation recently when Keir Starmer went off to Washington to try to persuade, reportedly, Joe Biden to allow Ukraine to use long-range missiles to strike deep inside Russia. The official narrative we're hearing is either that the Biden administration was cool to the proposal, did not approve it, or that it has delayed a decision. But I've seen reports in the last 48 hours that the Ukrainian military appears to have struck a number of ammunition depots deep inside the Russian Federation. So I am not at all convinced that the Ukrainians haven't been given the green light to proceed. And I think that these two developments that we're witnessing, they're happening in lockstep. Escalation of the war on the ground and escalation of the repression, that they're related to each other. And we should all be deeply concerned about them. One thing is for sure, and I'll close on this note, I'm not going to take lectures in journalistic ethics from any representative of the Canadian government or any representative of the Canadian corporate media. Thank you.
Thank you, Dimitry. And can anybody listen to your complete 2-hour dialogue with this shill, Zivo? Is this available on your website?
It is. I'm happy. In fact, I'll put a link to it in the chat for those who are interested in hearing the debate between. It was more of a debate than an interview, I would say.
That'd be good. Yeah. And what we'll do for those who are listening to this as a recording, we'll make the links to Hall's work as well as what you've just referenced in your excellent website available in the description box under this video as well for people to do more research. Thank you so much for going through that. Hall Gardner, I think most people were on our last session 2 weeks ago. They got to be introduced to Hall's remarks and mode of thinking, which is very constructive, very good. And I've looked at Hall's background as well. He's somebody who is an expert in international relations. He's been at the cutting edge, warning about the expansion of NATO way before most people were on that bandwagon. And he's written a number of books, As I mentioned, his website is available in the description box. Also a poet. Very curious to see to read some of your activist poetry as well.
Maybe I should read poetry and forget the rest.
So yeah, go for it. I know you're gonna have more of a solution orientation today, so thank you. Go, it's all yours.
Okay.
Matt, do you forget to mention that Hall is speaking to us from Paris? This is very important.
Well, actually, I'm in San Sebastian, but that's a different story. But thank you, Matt. Thank you, Ed and Dimitry, for the excellent introduction. I'm going to try to synthesize a little bit of the history and the present, if I can. I'm sorry I spoke from darkness in our last session. My computer wasn't functioning correctly, but this time I think you can see me. I want to say that it's very interesting that we gave that history of the NSC 75. The person I'm going to quote today wrote NSC 68, which is seen as the doctrine that militarized containment in 1950. It was actually written before the Korean War, and it probably wouldn't have even been considered if the Korean War hadn't broken out just a few months after this NSC 68 was written. Paul Nitze was seen as the Cold Warrior along with George Kennan, who both founded the doctrine of containment. George Kennan was soft containment, political economic containment of the Soviet Union. Paul Nitze was hard containment, military containment, particularly after the Soviet Union developed its nuclear weapons. What's interesting about both of them and why I'm tying them in here is both of them oppose NATO enlargement. The two founders of containment opposed NATO enlargement. But you can't think of people who had more experience in dealing with the Soviet Union than those two, and yet they were completely ignored by the Clinton administration. So this is what Paul Nitze sent me, an unpublished editorial. The Washington Post didn't take this editorial at the time. I don't know if he ever published it or not, but this is what he said in 1995. With the vulnerability of Russia's new democracy, pushing for NATO enlargement will likely exacerbate the existing destructive internal pressures. A wrong move on our part could easily backfire, triggering to rise to power by Russia's nationalists, sidetracking START to nuclear arms agreement, and possibly unraveling other arms control agreements, without which NATO will find itself back in a Cold War environment. It is far better to act on the belief that Russian nationalists are growing in political power and be wrong by curtailing a NATO expansion than it is to risk European instability in the face of a new confrontation with Moscow. Our long-term objective should be to promote the engagement, not the exclusion of Russia in Europe. I wrote that in 95, just as the Clinton administration was beginning to expand NATO larger, and this went along with a whole group of former officials, including supreme commanders of NATO, who all opposed NATO enlargement, because we had a real opportunity that I talked about last week, the Partnership for Peace. That could have been implemented under Clinton. Clinton did consider it in his first term, but ruled it out in his second term, as I talked about last week. Now, what were the wrong turns that Nitze actually, I think, at least predicted? The first wrong turn was NATO's air war over Kosovo versus the Russian and Chinese ally Serbia. That was the wrong move, the first wrong move on the part of the U.S. that backfired, and that helped cause the power of Russian nationalists who formed a national security consensus under Vladimir Putin. That's the first major error. The second major error was the expansion of NATO. First, they expanded to the Baltic states, which was already over one of Yeltsin's red lines. But then in 2008, announcing the expansion of NATO, potential expansion or future expansion of NATO to Ukraine and Georgia. And this was announced at the 2008 Bucharest Summit against the views of France and Germany, just showing the divisions within NATO itself about this momentous decision that everyone knew would provoke a backlash, including the present CIA director, William Burns, as I mentioned last time, who was ambassador to Moscow back then. And prior to the Bucharest Summit, he warned Russia is particularly worried that the strong divisions in Ukraine over NATO membership, with which much of the ethnic Russian community is against, could lead to a major split, involving violence or at worst civil war. In that eventuality, Russia would have to decide whether to intervene, a decision Russia does not want to have to face. And I emphasize that point because I don't think this was, as we've seen, as has been propagandized about, a decision, Putin's decision, so-called special military operation, was not something this was really wanted. Okay. So in my view, then, we're not sleepwalking into a possible major power confrontation, but walking directly into it or running directly into it. Now, I want to mention some other things. You mentioned Brzezinski and Henry Kissinger. Both of them were initially for NATO enlargement, but both of them later on, in my view, belatedly, I've been consistently for Ukrainian neutrality from 94 on. Both of these guys, Brzezinski and Kissinger, finally realized that not making Ukraine neutral would provoke a Russian backlash. So up until the actual invasion, at least Kissinger and Brzezinski died, but Kissinger was against NATO enlargement to Ukraine. He switched once Russia entered at Ukraine, but I still think he's wrong. Okay, once the idea of Ukrainian membership in NATO was on the table, in my view, it became impossible to really deal with any kind of compromise. So the Dimitry Medvedev's proposal for a new European security treaty was just ignored without engaged negotiation. He proposed that in 2008, 2009. That flopped. NATO wouldn't even consider it. Obama, Biden, Clinton efforts to reset was a disaster. They couldn't even get the term reset translated properly in Russia, which says a lot about our State Department capabilities of understanding Russian to begin with. And I'm not a Russian speaker, so I'm not going to claim any better understanding of Russia, but it was really embarrassing. And of course that reset failed miserably. I was involved in track two discussions with the East-West Institute at that time, and those talks, which went on to the OSCE, failed to move beyond the OSCE. So the whole idea of resetting fell apart really in the period 2008, 2009. Then, once the invasion of, the annexation of Crimea took place, that began to militarize NATO. Sweden, Finland began to consider membership around that time, actually a little bit earlier. And the Minsk and Normandy talks over the Donbass region, in my view, could only fail because the larger issue of NATO enlargement wasn't considered. It wasn't part of the discussions. So in my view, by the way, the Trump administration really did nothing to help France and Germany to put pressure on Ukraine to make a deal with Moscow. And I'm a little bit critical of what Trump did during that period, because I think he could have had a chance to prevent this if he had really worked at it. In my view, he didn't work at it. So, okay, once the Russian invasion took place, Russian demands that Ukraine remain neutral were ruled out by NATO Secretary Stoltenberg, who stated that NATO's relationship with Ukraine is going to be decided by the 30 NATO allies and Ukraine, no one else. So this kind of attitude part of NATO realized the kind of hubris and excessive machoism, I suppose you could put it, in NATO pushing forward. Once it's made this decision, it can't backtrack. Now, nevertheless, despite the Putin's failed effort, once Putin invaded, he failed to press Kiev into submission, and so this was a major change in the way the war was going to proceed, because he couldn't stage a coup or throw out Zelensky's government. The March April 2022 talks in Istanbul though they ultimately failed to secure a grain agreement in the long run, still opened the possibility that there could be an acceptance of Ukraine as a neutral country. But once again, there's two sides of this dimension, two dimensions of this crisis. First is that it's the Russian-Ukraine dimension, the conflict, the historical conflict, because NATO enlargement has opened up a historical bloodlands of that whole region. And that's what the West, particularly Americans, don't understand the history of this region and why the transformation, the balance of power in this region is so volatile. So the first is the Russian-Ukraine division, and the second dimension of it, and which is in my mind even more worrisome, is the US-NATO-Russia dimension, which has to be addressed as well. So in order for this war to come to an end, a resolution to both the Russia-Ukraine conflict must be implemented. But to do that, both sides have to reach a mutually hurting stalemate. Yet the problem here is what might hurt Ukraine might not seem to hurt Russia and vice versa. The nature of hurt is subjective and asymmetrical. So in order to prevent this war from widening, which it shows signs of doing, as was just talked about by Dimitry, in which long-range deep strike weapons seem to be developing. Romania just today wants Ukraine wants Romania to shoot down drones that are flying near its airspace. This is how wars widen. And the war can widen not just to NATO, Russia, it can widen in other regions of the planet. And I'd watch out for North and South Korea. So this war has to end as soon as possible. So both sides have to realize that the war is getting out of control and is not in either of their interests, nor in those of the international community. So what we need is concerted contact groups. We've already seen efforts of the United Arab Emirates just to help mediate prisoner exchanges. Qatar tried to extend, the talks were held off supposedly because of the Kursk incursion, Ukraine going into the Kursk region. But one possibility there Qatar was going to negotiate was to limit strikes on civilian and energy infrastructure. So this very idea that they were beginning to talk about that shows that both sides need to begin to consider that. So furthermore, both Moscow and Kiev could possibly agree that certain areas and targets could be designated off limits, nuclear power plants, etc., oil refiners, energy refiners, urban population centers. Other areas could be considered off limits for their war, just to begin to de-escalate before you can reach a ceasefire and a permanent settlement. Now, the other thing's interesting is that the beginning of these 2022 talks was the possibility that Kiev could get not NATO membership, but multilateral security guarantees from a coalition of states that include Israel, Turkey, Canada, and the US, and even the European Union as a whole. So if we can get a resolution and that begins lead to a ceasefire, then Ukraine can feel somewhat secure. We can reduce the weaponry on both sides, create areas which would be demilitarized, and perhaps put peacekeepers in those areas. Partnership for peacekeepers that I talked about before, which NATO still has but hasn't really developed, and maybe we can get the beginnings of a settlement. Now the problem, though, is in the background. NATO and Russia are beginning a new escalation, and that is the deployment of intermediate-range ballistic missiles. Germany has agreed to deploy a new American intermediate-range missiles on a rotational basis beginning in 2026. President Putin retorted, if these deployments go forward, Russians will consider themselves free from a unilateral moratorium on such weapons. Therefore, we're back in 1977-79 in the Euro missile crisis, which came very close to a nuclear war in 1983 during the Able Archer NATO military exercises and feared threats of a nuclear attack by NATO on Russia. And the alliance is beginning to deploy its B-61 12 nuclear. These are upgraded tactical nuclear weapons, that it will be put on the F-35 aircraft. So these elements are going on behind the scenes just at the time when it looks like Russia and Ukraine could possibly begin to settle some issues, though both sides seem to be trying to up the ante. And believe me, as Gandhi said, an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. And that's where we're heading right now. But this will be a nuclear blindness if it continues the way it's going. Thank you.
Well said. This is a very important conversation. I want people to think about any questions that they have. And as I mentioned in the chat box, pop your name in the chat box. Make your question short. We have about 35 or so minutes to go. Also, answers will be condensed as humanly possible, too, depending on how many questions we have. Ed, this is your brainchild. The American University in Moscow is, we have to be reminded, hosting this platform. Do you have any considerations before we launch into a dialogue with the audience?
I don't want to take time from those three great speakers, but just only briefly have to alert people that next week actually will be a crucial one, since we know that illegitimate president of Ukraine is coming to New York with a plan pushing Biden simply to allow those long-range missiles to hit Russia. We see some hesitation. Ironically enough, at least according, of course, we know what's going on inside, but at least according to people who say we are in the know, it's Pentagon who is becoming moderator. The force to push for this nuclear war is State Department. So this is kind of a switch. We usually know that State Department has to be like on diplomatic front and Pentagon on the military. And what we see, well, of course, this is not confirmed. We will know pretty soon. But at least knowledgeable people say that it's Pentagon who understands the consequences of what could happen. And they kind of try to play this moderate role to balance what Blinken, I would consider him probably the main great cardinal. He actually already announced that he already knows, has Biden in his pocket, and then Biden's going to approve. So far, Biden didn't. So maybe he's still listening to the Pentagon. Another option, I was asked, those days I do a lot of interviews, and I asked for someone, what do you think Putin should do? Well, I can't give advice to Putin, except one that maybe he will, he's not going to New York, but I think he's sending his foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, and maybe he will deliver a message of peace. And Matthew started with George Bush Sr. when he said that he knows he wants this new world security architecture. And he mentioned edit from Vancouver to Vladivostok. This was George Bush Sr., and I'm lucky to be in the room when he said this. Well, let's see what maybe Putin can offer his vision on this new world security infrastructure and see how the world reacts. This is a very important week we are facing, very important week. Some call it Russian roulette. Well, let's hope that maybe it will not come to this, but this is just my very brief points. I don't want to take more time, and please, speakers, wonderful speakers can answer any questions, and no, go ahead.
Sounds good. Yeah. And I think, yeah, that's a good point that there's, the current system that we've been living through is, it's designed to collapse it. It's not like, globalization is melting down because of an accident. If you look at the wiring, how it was brought online, especially in the early 70s, what we're experiencing now is not an accident. It's a direct consequence of how the machine was set up to become a bubble, a time bomb that would blow. So we will get a new order, a new architecture will emerge. The question is, will it serve a sociopathic, self-professed elite? that have a certain view of humanity that is pretty dark, or is it going to serve the people of the world and our true self-interest as a species capable of making discoveries, participating in improving upon those discoveries by improving the conditions of life of our people and our children, or not? That's the battle right now. And I know that the BRICS foreign ministers are also going to be meeting at the sidelines of the UN in New York very shortly. So that's also a discussion, as you pointed out, which is a constructive one about preparing for a slightly more healthy system to replace the dying zombie that we've been, pumping blood into for the past years of bailouts. So that's an interesting thing to keep an eye on. The first question I saw getting in there is from Tony Pappert. So Tony, if you're still there, take yourself off mute and pose your thought.
Sure, I'm here. We're at a critical moment on the eve of a U.S. election. And we have on the one side the candidate of Dick Cheney and the secret government, which is driving toward World War III, which is trying to physically eliminate President Trump. And on the other side, we have a candidate who, as you all know, in the debate recently, refused to say that he wanted a Ukrainian victory and instead said that he wanted to stop the killing and that he would act to do so, if elected, during November, long before inauguration. So I think that the speakers and others on this call, frankly, at least to the extent they're allowed to do so, have got to weigh in on this. I mean, I think the choice is clear if you accept the facts. But I think many of you, even on this call, are infected by Trump derangement syndrome. And so you refuse to accept the facts before you, and you're content with a disaster, which would be a Kamala Harris election, which would, I think, result in war before inauguration in January. I mean, just to close, I mean, I know people who are affected with Trump derangement syndrome. It's very difficult to deal with. It's very difficult under a lot of social pressure to separate what President Trump has actually said and done for the past years and the past decades from what's attributed to him by mass media. But I think we have to do so. I think the outcome of this election is absolutely critical for war and peace.
Thank you, Tony. Any remarks in regards to Tony's input?
I'm happy to chime in.
Go for it, Dimitry.
I have I'll tell you, Tony, quite candidly, and I don't want to offend anybody, I have an almost universally negative opinion about Donald Trump, but at the same time, I do not regard myself as one of the many people in the progressive community who suffer from Trump derangement syndrome. It is a real thing. It is a huge problem. I actually am more alarmed by Kamala Harris than I am by Donald Trump. And I've said repeatedly that the single most important thing that was said in the debate between Harris and Trump, which was 100% true, a simple statement of fact, came from Donald Trump. And he said it 3 times. He said, Russia has a nuclear arsenal. It was by far the most important thing that was said. The moderators ignored it. The pundits ignored it, but it was critical. And on that basis alone, if I had to choose between the two of them, I would probably choose Donald Trump, because I think Kamala is more likely to take us into a nuclear war. But as it happens, I'm working on the campaign of Jill Stein. I don't have any illusions about Jill Stein's, prospects for winning. I acknowledge that. All I can say is if I had to choose between Trump and Harris, I would probably take Trump. I'd hold my nose because I think the risk of nuclear annihilation is greater with Kamala Harris.
Yep. If I could,
I think Hall wants to chime in. Yeah, Hall.
Well, I've been writing on this for World War Trump's one of my books. You might want to look at that one. The way he handled North Korea was a disaster. I'm sorry, regardless of what he says, North Korea wants to invite him back, and they can rediscuss things. That was just bullshit. He went along with the National Security Advisor. What's his name? I'm blanking on his name at the moment.
Bolton?
Bolton, who obviously was going to lead to a disaster because the guy can only think in military terms, containment terms. So that's one point, okay? The second point is, I'm sorry, in Ukraine, he not only did he not help the French and Germans negotiate the Normandy talks, he made it more possible for NATO to deploy its naval forces in the Black Sea region. There were things. Now he was less vocal. I mean, he was seen as, and I don't fall for the media bullshit about him falling for Putin and all that stuff. But nevertheless, I really honestly don't think he really achieved as much of its rhetoric. And the other problem, he just flip-flops all the time. You don't know what he's going to do. If he provided more confidence, I would support him. Now, on the Democrat side, I'm in agreement. I don't trust the Democrats either. I'm an independent. However, I do know, I worked on it myself. In 2008, the Democrats did try and failed to reset U.S.-Russia relations, but it was a complete failure, as I said earlier, precisely because the question of Ukrainian neutrality was on the table at that time. So there was no way they could have reset relations. Now, read my article in MEER, M-E-E-R, and I have a critique of both of them. As I said, I'm not a fan of either. Nevertheless, I'm supporting Harris because I still think the Democrats could, once they begin to reset their brains, they can begin to wind this down. And I want to say one more point. The Pentagon is being more moderate than the Democrats, and I totally agree. And the State Department, Anthony Blinken is too ideological. They need a new national security. There are people. Philip Gordon is behind, is advisor to Kamala Harris on national security. He has a more moderate view. He's less ideological. He did help arrange the Iran nuclear accord. He was very that's at least a sign you can talk to the so-called enemy and engage in dialogue. So I'm not going to. My point here is I'm convinced either one of them will start World War III if neither of them begin an engagement with Russia now. Okay, don't make myself clear.
Ed, you want to chime in a word or two on that, or you want to go to the next question?
First of all, I want to say that I'm happy that this is a bipartisan crowd, so we're not being accused of kind of Trump stooges and all that. So thank you all to make sure that we are even.
Well, okay, good. No, I'm just saying. My irony here is I support a lot of what Trump says rhetorically. It's just that I don't see it in reality, and that's my problem. And I do agree the Democrats could lead us in that direction. War if we don't, as I said, don't begin to engage in Russia as soon as possible. Make it pretty clear.
All right, so let's jump into Robert. Robert, are you still there?
Yeah, I'm here. I guess I already wrote it in the chat, but I guess I'll just repeat that. Well, again, I'm glad also to Ed's point that this is a bipartisan crowd. We may not agree on origins of this conflict, but we want it to end, and we don't want World War III. So I'm glad we're all in agreement about that. As for the questions, because these speakers have been Canadian, Matt, and of course Dimitry, I guess I'm assuming is also Canadian. I'd like to ask, one of the most horrible episodes of this war was when Zelensky came to the Canadian Parliament and there was that Waffen SS member. And I thought just how brainwashed Canada had become, the fact that this Waffen SS member could be saluted by the Canadian Parliament. And frankly, I don't buy that Krista Freeland didn't understand enough Ukrainian history to know that that was a Waffen SS member. So I wonder if Canada, has over 1 million Ukrainians or Ukrainian descent Canadians. So I was wondering if my first question is, could there be a campaign as a way of, because obviously they're going to say they're Putin's stooges. Maybe one idea would be to fight against this by saying, why don't we oppose and try to take down Bandera statues in Canada as a way of fighting against this pro-war thing? And the second question, I guess, and this is much more to the Canadians here, I fear that when Justin Trudeau went after the Canadian truckers, he suspended bank accounts. Are you afraid that this sort of rainbow fascist government of Justin Trudeau could do that and maybe other things to you?
I'm certainly afraid. In fact, that the confiscation of the bank accounts happened under something called the Emergencies Act. This was national security legislation that was adopted decades ago, and no one had ever invoked it before, ever. The truckers were used as a pretext to do it. I believe it was an experiment. They saw an opportunity. There was a lot of anger amongst the populace, particularly in Ottawa, because my daughter lived in Ottawa during the truckers' protest. She was a student there. And I actually went there and walked the streets and spoke to the truckers to see for myself what was happening. And they did cause immense inconvenience to the lives of the city, of the capital. People live in the capital for some time. But I also saw no signs of violence, none whatsoever. I didn't see any expressions of support for Nazism. In fact, I heard a lot of people counsel their fellow truckers to remain peaceful no matter what the police did, even when they moved in and began to take them forcibly out of the streets. So there was a lot of complete propaganda being disseminated about that whole affair, whether or not you agree politically with the agenda of the truckers. And it was used as a pretext to see how far the government could go in suppressing dissent. In terms of, and I think we should be very concerned about that. I'm quite convinced that it's going to be used again now that the precedent has been set, and it'll be used in circumstances where much more important forms of dissent are being suppressed. As far as the Canadian Parliament is concerned, I completely agree with your assessment. I think they knew this man had served voluntarily in the Galicia Waffen SS. I think what happened was they got a much stronger backlash from the grassroots Jewish community, Parliament did, after this disgraceful episode. And so they were forced to basically disavow this man, Yaroslav Hunka. Interestingly, the postscript to this, Canadians might not know this, but there was an investigation done by a parliamentary commission a few decades ago into the influx of Nazis, particularly from Ukraine after the Second World War. It was called the Deschênes Report. And the government of Pierre Trudeau, the father of Justin Trudeau, suppressed very important extracts from that report, very sensitive information about who these Nazis were and what they did once they arrived in the country. The affair in Parliament with Yaroslav Hunka has revived the debate, and now the government is having to deal with the increasing demands that the full report be disclosed. And there have been reports that the government is concerned that if it discloses the full report, this is unbelievable. It's unbelievable to even hear this. They're concerned that there will be prosecutions of Nazis in Canada who should have been prosecuted years ago. Because they're concerned about the prosecution of Nazi war criminals, they are reluctant to release the report. That's the world in which we live in Canada.
Are any of them actually still alive? I mean, I imagine most of them are dead at this point.
There's Hunka.
Apparently some of them are. Some of them are still.
Yeah, that's real inside out land, eh? No, it's Orwell would really be rolling in his grave, I'm sure. And I mean, on top of that, you have the Emergencies Act, as I've written about this in a few chapters in the Clash of the Two Americas, has been used in the past by the former Trudeau regime as well in 1970. We shouldn't forget the first false flag induced Emergencies Act, the martial law of Quebec in October 1970, where there were tanks on the street. And as it was discovered in hindsight, and again, books have been written, this is irrefutable. The RCMP was caught actually managing cells of those very FLQ anarcho-terrorists, or not even anarcho, they were supposedly Maoist Leninist terrorist cells that were putting letter bombs throughout Quebec, which were discovered to be managed by a certain branch of the RCMP that got rewired and rebranded when they were discovered to have been doing that to scare the hell out of people. Smells a lot like Operation Gladio, tied to NATO. And that got rebranded into CSIS in 1983, basically taking over the controls and the responsibilities of a lot of those activities that that branch, the Special Operations branch of the RCMP, were doing. But all habeas corpus, all rights were thrown out the window very quickly. And another point I would also mention is 1946, the Guzenko affair was the first use of the Emergencies Act after World War II. Again, took down all of the anti-fascist resistance at the Progressive Labour Party of Canada. Fred Rose, Sam Carr, the people who were actually calling out members of Parliament were parts of the Progressive Labour Party, the Labour Progressive Party. They were the ones who were behind the Louis Papineau Mackenzie Battalion fighting Franco. in Spain, and they were the ones who were calling out the Wall Street London operation behind the rise of eugenics in Canada and the United States. They were the most vocal anti-fascists, working with Paul Robeson and Henry Wallace, and they were all given secret trials. They were arrested, no lawyers, for weeks and weeks, tortured, and some given illegal prison sentences for. I mean, I say illegal because the actual claims that they were Russian agents, there was no evidence ever, and that was discovered when the so-called evidence used against them was declassified in 1985. There was nothing there. There was just phone book scans, and so I mean, when you start scratching behind the surface of things, you start appreciating what is the machinery managing the so-called sovereign nation of Canada, or many nations. So definitely, we should be very concerned. I share Dimitri's concerns immensely. But that being said, the fact that there is also a fight by certain adult. There is a discussion that is being fought for. Tony alluded to that, I think, in a very important way. I think the op-ed by RFK Jr. and Trump published in The Hill is a very important op-ed that really does bring a reality that certain deep state operators don't want us to think about into the conversation. So yeah, I mean, we have to really just keep on pushing on the truth and reality to break through this, because it is going into a very bad place. And the Canada has a lot of Nazis and Nazi skeletons in the closet for sure. We got time for a couple more questions. Maybe 15 minutes left, so I ask that those questions be posed briefly, concisely. Got Ken and Elisa who got in there that I noticed. Anybody who wanted to ask a question that we may have missed, I apologize, but we'll throw you the chance in 2 weeks from now when we meet back again. Ken, I saw first. I see your hand there, Elisa. I'll get at you soon. So Ken Freeland, just take yourself off mute and go for it.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. So going backwards in time here to Hall's point, to add to the Trump indictment, we have to remember his unilateral withdrawal from the IMF treaty, which sort of set up the entire situation that we're dealing with now. Having said that, I do believe that we're looking at a reprise of the 2016 election, where Hillary Clinton's saber rattling was discountenanced by the American people in favor of Donald Trump's more amicable campaign rhetoric toward Russia. Having said that, I want to go back to Tony's point, his surprising claim that many of us here might be suffering from Trump derangement syndrome. I think that's extremely unlikely. However, I will substitute for that the determination that Trump could be much worse than Kamala Harris when it comes to the Middle East. And those of us who recognize this fact and examine his funding sources cannot in good conscience vote for either of these two fascists. And so, having said that, I would concur with the guy, I can't remember who it was, that said he's working for the Stein campaign. I think there are other alternatives, ways to vote against Kamala Harris without voting for Donald Trump, sadly. Okay, that's it.
Yeah.
Any comments or responses? Hall, yeah, there you are.
Just thank you. I forgot the obvious. Going out of the INF, that means we're going into a war fighting mode, because that was the whole problem way back in 1977 to 1987, when the Russians were deploying their SS-20s against Europe and Japan, and the U.S. decided to deploy cruise and Pershing missiles in Europe, and we almost came to nuclear war in 1983 because of that. So Trump's decision was a dangerous decision. It wasn't taken lightly, and there was no effort to really renegotiate that treaty. The problem was China, and both China and the Chinese intermediate arrangements. I can go on in the whole thing. So my point is that's one issue. Other issues, I agree. If I thought Jill Stein could win, I'd vote for her. But my problem is the reality is the third parties in America haven't had just don't have the guts, not the guts, they have the guts. They don't have the following that we need to defeat to win the presidency. That's my problem. Otherwise, I would vote third party.
I just want to add that Trump also took us out of the JCPOA with Iran,
Right.
even though the IAEA certified that Iran was complying with the deal.
Exactly. Thank you.
Hey, Ed, you want to chime in, or are you good?
I think someone's holding hand. Yeah.
All right, we'll call up Elisa Rolston.
I just wonder if everything could be reframed in terms of the elites and the common people, because certainly in Canada, the government bureaucrats, they get heckled in every town that they go to. They can't walk anywhere. And Canada is the second largest landmass. It doesn't matter what town they fly into. People are ready to harass them back and forth wherever they go. So the common people are not, and the thing is, I just don't know, based on reading Matt's work, how much of our elections are real or fake. I have no idea. It seems like there's a huge campaign, whether it's Canada, US, or UK. I don't know the other countries that well, the other countries. There's a huge demoralize the common people campaign. So I think the Waffen SS person in the House of Commons, I think that was on purpose. And I think someone somewhere was saying, oh, let's screw up the Canadian mind. Like, I think it was, to me, it was like a 14-year-old kid who just does something destructive in the middle of their parents' fancy party just to get attention. To me, that's what that seemed like to me.
Possibly. Any thought on that, or? All right. Very possibly true. Ed, you want to say something?
Well, I see Alice Slater raising his hand, and then I will make an announcement about our next session.
Okay,
Alice,
sounds good. All right, Alice.
Thank you. Speaking from the belly of the beast in New York, I'm voting for Jill Stein. I mean, it doesn't matter which of those monsters get elected. Maybe we'll have a break from Trump with Russia. It's possible he might want to build a hotel in Moscow or something. But it'll be terrible in Israel. As a matter of fact, when they moved the capital to Jerusalem, that's what got Hamas crazy and attacked. I mean, he's like awful on that. And I think even that we want to improve between US and Russia, what we all have to do is get behind this slaughter, this genocide in Gaza, like Americans and Russians and everybody. And we have the kids with us. They're at the schools all over the world, demonstrating against the slaughter in Gaza. So I mean, democracy's on the rocks, whether it's Harris or Trump. We don't have democracy. We have the deep state. I mean, I don't even know who's running America right now. And I don't know how bad it is in Russia, but you have your problems. The thing is that Mother Earth is telling us we don't have much time. So I think we have to somehow shift our focus to how do we mobilize with all these young people and be certainly in America to be ready to mobilize the day whichever monster gets elected. It's going to be bad either way, and that's all I can hope for right now. I don't even know what else we can do. Thanks.
Okay, well, I think we are close to the end, and I want to just announce that our next session will be on October 6th. We have a great three speakers. Marta Ziff for many years was senior foreign correspondent for the Washington Times, knows Washington inside out, and he will share his thoughts on what Washington has become to. Then also from London, we need sane voice from London, because so far main voices from London are insane. So we need a couple sane voices from London, and this is Alistair Scott. And then third speaker will be former candidate for New York mayor, Anton Chaikin, and I know he's based now in New York or somewhere, definitely in the US. So in the meantime, I'll be sending you some interesting articles. Today, actually, I got a very interesting article from Mark Warnes. He lives around Boston, and he mentioned something that we are worried about missiles flying from Ukraine into Russia, but he talked about electromagnetic pulse. It will be like first preliminary strike by US, which will eliminate, all the, I don't know what exactly it will eliminate, but it's a huge electromagnetic pulse. I sent you his article. I don't know if he's really expert in this field or he just read something, but definitely interesting. Maybe next time he will expand on this. And also good point is that our numbers are growing and countries are growing. We are now close to 220 participants from 27 countries. And this is something that I keep mentioning magazine New Continent, which I started. And this New Continent was dedicated to just American, I call them dissidents. Dissidents who disagree with US foreign policy. But now, after this project started, more and more dissidents from European countries, and now we see some of them right here. So this is something that is good. So I call our forces of good. We definitely want all people on this planet live in peace and enjoy what we keep saying this word, which we have to repeat: win-win, when everyone wins, and do what we can to promote this idea. But next week might be a crucial one. God save us all. Those who are religious, please go to your churches and synagogues and pray.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ed, and thank you, everybody. I'll also remind people that even though these discussions have been focusing on the battlefront of Ukraine as the spark plug, there are other spark plugs that will be touched upon in further seminars going forward. The Middle East, the Gaza, and that entire set of Gordian knots upon Gordian knots is going to be addressed, as well as the battle frontier of the expanding NATO of the Pacific, the Quad that we see encroaching upon China's perimeter, utilizing the Ukraine of the Pacific in the form of Taiwan as well. These are all going to be discussions with a vector towards solutions, because really the study of the past, the study of the present really doesn't have any meaning if we're not looking towards problem solving for the future. So this is going to be encouraged as we all practice these mental psycho-spiritual muscles going forward. So keep that in mind and invite more people to sign on, register on Ed's website. The link is in the description box to get more people, especially young people, involved. And thank you all for attending this Sunday, and we'll meet back in 2 weeks, same digital place, same digital time.